but also to Renee, representing the EU delegation, Vanessa, UNHCR, and I think we have Tia online from IOM. But also all my UN colleagues I see in the audience, the colleagues from the NGO sector, from the private sector, and my other U.N.डी.पी colleagues. Let me start by expressing a very huge thanks to our policy team. Where are they? Peter, Nassim, and the consultants Violetta, for the absolutely incredible job that they have done in producing this report that we're launching today. Deep appreciation, colleagues. Now, before I talk about the report, I want to begin somewhere a little more personal. Some of you know that I grew up a very long time ago in a very small but very poor village in rural Jamaica. I was one of those children that people sometimes talk about in development, the one who made it out, the first from the community to get to high school, to get to university, the first to get a proper job. But what has stayed with me all my life is not so much my own story, but the story of the people that I grew up with and who were left behind. The families walking long distances for water, the homes without electricity, without toilet. Children, my cousins, like myself, with enormous intelligence and potential, but who never had the chance to finish school. Women carrying burden that were invisible to everyone else outside of our community. People like my mother and my father, who worked unbelievably hard every single day and still couldn't get ahead. So when I read a report like this one, I do see the statistics, but I also see the faces of the people behind the statistics. I see the people I've met in Bamiyan, in Kandahar, in Kunar, in drought-affected communities, in flood zones, in places absorbing large numbers of returnees. Warm, kind, dignified, resourceful people. This mic is falling. But people who are struggling and deserve far more opportunities and support than they're currently receiving. And this, I believe, is what this report is all about. You know, you're going to hear terms like subsistence insecurity, and it may sound technical and academic. But what it means is something very human and very simple. We're talking about people not being able to live with dignity, not knowing if they will have enough food for the rest of the week, not being able to afford medicine. My own parents both died in the same hospital for the same reason when I was quite young. But parents lying awake at night, wondering how to keep their kids in school. Young people slowly losing faith that their lives will ever be better. This is what this report is about. And what this year's report tells us is something that is deeply troubling. Afghanistan and its people are facing not one crisis, but many crises at the same time, layered one on top of the other. A true is the scale of the mass returns. By the time this report went to press, 2.7 million people had returned to Afghanistan from neighboring countries in 2025 alone. And we should pause for a moment to reflect on what that means. We're talking about millions of people arriving into communities already struggling with poverty, water shortages, unemployment, and overstretched services. Families returning with almost nothing. And you saw the video of that man coming across from Pakistan at the Turkmen border in a wheelchair with the medical pins in his leg and 4 kids with him. I sat and spoke with that gentleman, and he had no idea what this future would be and what the future would be for his kids. And they're coming to communities that are trying to absorb them while barely coping themselves. You'll see more of the data when the consultants and my team present, but 92% of these returnees are subsistence insecure. Only 3% have access to formal employment. 81% are in debt. And school attendance among returnee girls has dropped to just 25%. And that's something we should also think a little bit about. A generation of girls slowly disappearing from classrooms and from ever having opportunities for a better life. The report tells us that 3 out of every 4 Afghans, around 29 million people, are now unable to meet their basic subsistence needs, unable to have food, water, energy, shelter. And perhaps most worrying of all, the figures barely changed since last year or the year before. So this is no longer temporary hardship. And I want us to reflect on this. This is no longer temporary hardship. This is becoming entrenched and enduring. Families are spending more than half of their income simply on food, leaving almost nothing for health, for education, or for building a better future. And as I mentioned, today 81% of Afghan households are in debt. It's a pretty bad sign. It means economic opportunities are scarce and shrinking, making survival unaffordable. And on top of all of this is a worsening climate crisis. Last year, around 1/3 of households reported experiencing drought conditions. This year, it rose to nearly 2/3. Access to safe drinking water fell sharply from 59% of households to just 44%. And the areas that were hardest hit by climate stress are often the very same areas absorbing the highest numbers of returnees. So what do we have? Drought, poverty, displacement, debt, exclusion, collapsing services, all coming together, no longer as separate challenges. We know, and you'll see it in the presentation, that the economy had modest growth last year, that inflation remained relatively stable and contained, that domestic revenues did increase, and that the de facto authorities have launched their first national development strategy. This is all positive, and we want to see more of this. The challenge, however, as you'll hear in the presentation, is that growth is far too limited and is not translating into jobs better services and opportunities for people. The per capita income figures are also heading in the wrong direction. At the same time, and you saw it in the video, more than 440 health facilities were closed or suspended operations last year. That means women unable to access maternal care. It means children missing vaccinations. It means people with treatable illnesses may die for lack of care. But colleagues, Excellency, despite everything, this report is not only a story of crisis. Across Afghanistan, we continue to see extraordinary resilience. Women running home-based businesses under immense constraints. Young people creating livelihood opportunities, creating jobs. I met some young tech entrepreneurs who are running businesses on Fiverr. They're online consulting businesses, even with limited access to finance. Communities rebuilding after droughts and floods. We saw the microfinance sector expand by more than 17% last year, with women accounting for 44% of borrowers. There's still energy in this society. There's still capability, there's still ambition, there's still hope. But resilience is not infinite. And one of the dangers in Afghanistan is that the extraordinary resilience of its people may sometimes cause the world to underestimate the burden, the depth of the burden that they're carrying. People survive, and because they survive, we assume they're coping. Many are not coping. They are enduring. And endurance should not be mistaken for recovery and for development. So this report, colleagues, is really a wake-up call. It is asking us to analyze Afghanistan differently. It is asking us to respond differently. It is asking us to ensure that there's greater coordination of efforts across the international community, across the NGO community, with the de facto authorities. It is asking for longer-term commitments and not just short-term aid. It is asking for much more integrated approaches, joined-up programs. It's asking for serious investments in livelihoods, in job creation, in private sector development, in water systems, in energy, in local markets, in health services, and so on. And it goes without saying, it continues to ask us for a firm commitment to ensuring that women remain part of Afghanistan's social and economic future. Because no country can succeed while systematically excluding half of its population. So in the end, this report is really about one simple question. What does it mean for millions of Afghan people to live year after year without the basic conditions necessary for a life of dignity, of security, and of hope? And we could also ask, what responsibility do all of us, including the de facto authorities, have to respond and to help change conditions for the millions of people? Those are the questions we need to ask and find answers to. Before I conclude, I just want to give a very quick, small story. I grew up in that village. There was another boy my age. We used to go to school together. And we all thought he was the brightest, smartest child in that village. Gradually, he stopped going to school because his parents didn't have the money. And by the way, it was a teacher who got the private sector to pay for some of my own expenses. But he dropped out of school, and he stayed in the village. And years later, when I went to university, I'd go and I'd see him, we'd talk, but he never left. He died a few years back, but he had the same capabilities. He just never got the opportunity. And millions upon millions of Afghan children, young people, are in the same position. Their subsistence insecure. Hopefully, we can use the support and mobilize the partnerships, mobilize the effort and the energy needed to help make a difference. Thank you, Tashakur.
This year, Violetta works with us every year to construct the Subsistence Insecurity Index, analyse the available data, and help draft the report. And Nazima Tahi, an economist here in our country office, who's written the economic overview section again of this year's report and supported the analysis throughout. So you'll hear from Violetta and Nazim shortly. I'd like to acknowledge Khalid Sultani, who provided critical data collection and analytical support for the report, Mujda Jalal for her administrative support for the report's production this year, and our U.N.डी.पी Afghanistan Communication Unit colleagues for their support with today's launch. I'd like to acknowledge our female colleagues in particular for all their hard work and dedication under the difficult circumstances of having to deliver while excluded from the office. I'd also like to thank colleagues from the REACH initiative for their collaboration in making the full whole of Afghanistan assessment data set available to us and for discussing and validating our use of the data. And UN colleagues who have worked with us on data for the report, including particularly colleagues from UNCTAD, IOM and UN Women. I'll hand over now to Nazim to begin our presentation of key findings from the report, followed by Violetta and myself. Thank you.
The core arguments or the core messages of the economic chapter and leave the details in the report for further reference in the future. So let's start with one of the very few good news, of course, which is the economy grew. It did not contract in 2024-2025. But the problem is that it did not grow much, and the extent of growth was not sufficient to meet the needs. And the rate of growth, therefore, was 1.9% in 2024-2025, which was lower than 2.3% economic expansion that was recorded a year before. And in terms of income per capita, which represents the welfare conditions of the society or the people that live in Afghanistan, we're seeing a stagnation, literally a growth rate of 0% during the same period, despite 1.9% growth in 2024-2025. And looking ahead, we're seeing that because of these returnees that are continuing to come from Iran and Pakistan, the income per capita is set to further decline by negative 2.1% in 2025-2026, which is again alarming, as Stephen alluded to in his remarks. The report records exchange rate appreciation and the end of a period of deflation as two important indicators of macroeconomic stability in Afghanistan. And as you can see on the chart on the left-hand side, you see that the Afghani parity improved or elevated opposite the US dollar throughout 2024 and 2025. And you can see in the chart that in December 2024, there was a sudden depreciation of Afghani from 67 Afghanis against $1 to 74. And that's a reflection of the sudden stop of some funding for the health sector and humanitarian sector in Afghanistan. And you see that after January 2025, all the way to December 2025, the Afghani continued appreciating as the parity of Afghanis per dollar reduced from 74 in January to 66.3 in December 2025. That represents a 10.4% appreciation. And the reason for that was because the de facto authorities auctioned US dollar cash in the market to stabilize the exchange rate. And you see that in the chart on the right-hand side that deflation ended toward late 2024, early 2025. And as of September 2025, we see that the inflation rose, the headline inflation rose to 2.1%. And the later data is included in the report, and we could have a look for additional explanation there. As for trade, the report records that trade is increasing. I mean, the trade circulation, if you can see the set of bars on the chart on the left-hand side toward the end, the total trade circulation, which is combination of exports plus imports, they're increasing year on year from 10 billion in 2023 all the way to nearly $15 billion in 2025. But that expansion is linked by growing imports, not necessarily by productivity enhancement in the economy or increasing exports, which remained stagnant at close to $2 billion a year. And as a result, we're seeing that the trade deficit expanded from 9.6 billion in 2024 to 11.3 billion in 2025, or nearly 62% of the total GDP. Another event that's recorded in the economic section of the report is the trade disruption because of the tension at the border with Pakistan that started in October 2025. You can see that after that tension broke out in October, the bilateral trade with Pakistan shrunk by nearly 94%. That's a near total cease of trade flow between the two countries. And that lost trade was rerouted somehow to other countries or other trade partners, such as Uzbekistan in the north and Kazakhstan, UAE, and China, but also Iran. And I have to mention that because this is an ex-post assessment of the economic trends, the report does not include a discussion of impacts of the situation in Iran and the Middle East, and we'll get to that in a later iteration of the report. There are some good, actually mixed developments in the banking sector or the overall financial system. As you can see on the chart on the left-hand side, the banking sector during 24-25 increased their deposits and assets by respectively by 4% and 5%. That meant that banks were gaining strength internally, but that strength did not necessarily translate into improved lending or credit to the business community in Afghanistan. But that gap is somehow being addressed by the expansion of the microfinance sector. So we have a macro financing situation, sector that's not helping the business community, but instead the microfinance has expanded its coverage and its inclusivity in 2024-2025. As you can see in this chart on the right-hand side, the number of provinces that had microfinance institutions increased from 14 provinces to 21 provinces, and the share of women clients increased from 37% to 44%. So that expansion in microfinance is somehow helping access to credit at the grassroots level, is specifically supporting jobs and income opportunities for women in the provinces. The economic discussion of the report somehow concludes by the key message in the external assistance environment in Afghanistan. As you can see, there was a drop in total external assistance that came to Afghanistan in 2025 compared to 2024, and the rate of that shrinkage was 16.5%. The total aid that came to Afghanistan in 2025 was $2.68 billion, down from $3.21 billion a year before. So there's an interesting trend in that. We're seeing an 11.3% increase in the amount of basic human needs funding, as opposed to humanitarian funding that had the biggest shrinkage in 2025 compared to 2024. Now that could be seen as a sign of a transition from humanitarian assistance to more of a lasting economic recovery supporting efforts in Afghanistan. So the bottom line in the economic story of the report is that the economy is not growing sufficiently.
Using the 2025 survey, and for the index in 2025, we saw that headcount intensity stayed stable, and 3 out of 4 people, 74% to be precise, were subsistence insecure, only slightly lower than the 75% recorded in 2024. This is the graph on the left-hand side. However, keeping in mind the very big population growth that Nassim just discussed, if we calculate the number of deprived individuals in absolute numbers, we saw an increase of an estimated 1.4 million in destitute people. Significant deterioration was observed in various indicators, most notably in healthcare unavailability and adverse environmental events. On the other hand, we did see some strong improvements. These were related to sanitation and winter clothing due to targeted humanitarian assistance programs. Had there not been this humanitarian assistance, the share of destitute people would have been even higher. On the right-hand side, you can see the results when we evaluated the index for urban and rural households. As in previous years, the divide between urban and rural households remained stark. 78% of urban households, 78% of rural households were classified as deprived, as opposed to 62% of urban, with the shares being similar as in the previous year. Rural deprivation was higher across nearly all indicators, particularly those linked to infrastructure, climate exposure, and access to essential services. We also evaluated the index for the 8 regions of the country. Although nationally, from the previous year, subsistence security was stable, when we look at the regions, disparities widened even further. The worst level of subsistence security, you can see on the graph on the right-hand side, the more red, the higher the subsistence security, was observed in the eastern region at 92%, an exceptionally high number, followed by the Central Highlands and the northeastern regions at 88% and 89% respectively. The relatively best performing region were the southern region, 61%, and the central region where Kabul is located at 53%. It's the light yellow that you see there in the middle. Year on year, the southern region showed the sharpest improvement, while the eastern region deteriorated the most. Turning now to household finances, we see on the left-hand side that household monthly income increased in real terms by 10%, while expenditure declined in real terms by 6%. Now, before I say more about this increase, let me point out, as Stephen also highlighted, food costs in 2025 exceeded half of total expenses, which is a very strong indicator of deteriorating household welfare. Now, going back to the increase in income, unfortunately, this increase is not due to earnings. The increase in income is due to borrowing. We see debt increasing by around 2%, so 2% more households having debt. But even more, we see a sharp increase in the amount of debt, around 11% from the previous year. When we took income and we split it into earned and assisting income, it's the bars that you see in the middle, we saw that actually earned income, the share of earned income dropped from 96 to 87%, while assisted income increased from 4 to 13. This assisted income was mainly borrowing from family, friends, and the community. Now, going to the right-hand side of the graph that we talk about employment, we saw that employment shares in households didn't change much from the previous year. Very high number for men at 85%. However, when we looked at the type of employments, we see the mix of jobs changing. While in 2024, the dominant employment type was own production, this changed and it became casual labor, which partially explains, of course, the drop in earned income. We then looked at food consumption, healthcare, water, and natural disasters, among other things. We knew already from the IPC that there was a temporary improvement in food security in early 2025 that unfortunately deteriorated by the end of the year. And compared to the year before, it was again a deterioration. We also observed that in our household survey. While in 2024, 30% of households were in the acceptable food consumption category, this dropped to 22%. Now, turning to healthcare, first let me point out that the Afghan health sector relies extremely on external funding. With international aid declining, there was a severe funding gap. And as Stephen already mentioned, around 445 health centers closed or suspended their services in 2025. At the same time, demand for health services rose. From 89%, it jumped to 94%. That's pretty much all households had at least one member requiring health care. However, while these needs went up, unfortunately, the share of households not being able to obtain the necessary health care increased from 16 to 23%. The worsening of healthcare access is also reflected in the barriers that households reported. While in 2024, the main barrier to accessing healthcare was cost, in 2025, the main issue was systemic unavailability of medicine, services, and staff. Now, turning to the water situation, a bit more to the right, water scarcity is unfortunately deepened. We had an increase of people reporting insufficient drinking water. 59% of households reported full sufficiency of drinking water in 2024, and this share dropped quite substantially to 44%. Households faced wider water access problems. The most notable one to mention is reports of non-functional or dried up water points that tripled from 10 to 31%. While when we looked at how many households don't report problems at all, only 28% of them reported having no water access problem, and that share dropped from 35% from the previous years. Now, this issue, of course, connects to the issue of natural disasters and environmental shocks that you see on the right-hand side. We have quite a big increase in the households reporting being affected by at least one natural disaster, from 47% to 68%, and that natural disaster was mainly drought. The incidence of households reporting being affected adversely by drought doubled, from 34% to 64%. Flooding, on the other hand, anticipated, however, from 19 to 10%. However, let me point out that some region, like the eastern region, was particularly affected by it. Our next section in the report talks about the conditions for women in the country. Since August 2021, the de facto authorities have imposed severe restrictions on women and girls, making Afghanistan the most repressive country for women. These restrictions are even reflected in large-scale surveys, like the survey that we are analyzing in this report. It is the first year that we are analyzing this survey, where it was not possible to undertake in-person interviews with female-headed households in all regions of the country, and particularly in the central region, which is the most populous and relatively most prosperous region. So in order to facilitate the comparative analysis between male and female-headed households, this section concentrates only on provinces where data are available for both types. That's why you might see some differences between these sections and the numbers I just showed you in the previous section. Now, the restrictions on women's mobility have confined them to their homes. In consultations with Afghan women, 56% of them indicated that they leave their home less than once a day, and a staggering 21% leave their home less than once a week. On the right-hand side, we are reporting some data on the lack of civil documentation. As you can see, the lack of civil documentation for women was alarmingly high. By 2025, only 1 in 4 households had valid civil documentation for all female members, while around 1 in 6 had none. Turning to education, as you already know, Afghanistan remains the only country in the world where girls above the age of 12 are barred from secondary and higher education. In 2025, you can see on the left-hand side, school attendance for girls stagnated at 42% compared to 73% for boys. Let me point here out that the restrictions on education for women and girls do not reflect public sentiment. A UN Women door-to-door survey showed widespread support for female education. 88% of men, 94% of women support education for girls and women. Now, in the middle, you can see some statistics related to literacy. Literacy gaps are stark. Among household heads, female literacy was less than half that of males. Now, in the subsample of provinces that we are discussing here, we see that household members in both types of households have literacy rates at 39%. We evaluated this also at the national level, putting all provinces, and this value is 43%. It's a very low value. On the right-hand side, you see some results on healthcare situation for male and female-headed households. As we already discussed, the situation is critical. And while the demand for healthcare was very high for both types of households, you can see 97% and 95% for 2025. However, female-headed households were less likely to obtain the necessary care, as you can see on the right here. In 2025, 1 in 4 male-headed households had members unable to access healthcare, and this number was even higher, 1 in 3 for female-headed households. Now, besides the effects on the physical health of women and girls, their mental health is also at high risk. In telesurveys performed by UN Women, found that 75% of Afghan women rated their mental health as bad or very bad. Turning to employment and income, we notice, as in previous years, that female-headed households had higher adult employment, but unfortunately also higher child labor. Now, in 2025, female-headed households shifted from casual labor to home-based on production, while on the other hand, male-headed households relied even more on casual labor. This shift that we see in employment resulted in higher income gains for female-headed households, as you can see on the right-hand side in this graph. Now, We have to add here that female-headed households relied more on informal safety nets to supplement their income. However, even if we looked only at earnings, female-headed households had slightly higher per capita earnings than their male counterparts. This, of course, depended on heavier household labor, but nevertheless, this was an improvement from the previous year, where we reported that female-headed households exerted greater work only to achieve lower per capita income. So in that sense, we do see an improvement, at least in this subsample of provinces that we are looking at. Now, we also evaluated the subsistence security, like we did at the beginning. Again, keep in mind that this is a subsample now of the data. That's why the numbers are a bit different from what I showed you before. Subsistence security was very high in 2025, at 87% for both types of households. Compared to the previous year, female-headed households were at similar levels. However, we see that male-headed households also deteriorate to come at similar levels with female-headed households. When we looked at indicators, most of the indicators showed similar deprivation levels, with two exceptions. The lack of working men in female-headed households and being affected by adverse environmental events in the case of male-headed households. Now, our next session does a deep dive into provinces that were highly impacted by retail needs. As it was already discussed, between 2023 and 2025, around 4.9 million people returned to Afghanistan. Most returnees settled in 12 provinces, and in these 12 provinces, we focused our analysis on. And I start by showing you some of the statistics. Let me just say a bit something about the color coding that we are using here. The yellow are local community households. Dark purple are recent returnee households, while light purple are non-recent returnees. Now, on the left-hand side, you can see some results relating to documentation. And you can see returnees, both recent and non-recent, but particularly so non-recent, have much lower shares in terms of having full documentation for their members. Now, turning to education attendance, we see again very low education attendance for particularly recent returnees. You see even for boys at 41%, but exceptionally low at 25% for girls. On the right-hand side, we have some healthcare needs and access. Across all three types of households, we have very high healthcare needs. You can see 94 to 98%. But as you can see, recent returnees in particular were less likely to obtain the necessary care. Now, turning to employment, we saw that returnees and local households had similar shares of employment. However, when we looked deeper into the types of employment that households are engaged in, we saw a big disparity. While you can see on the left-hand side graph, the right-hand side bars, okay, you can see that recent and non-recent returnees are mainly engaged in casual labor at exceptionally high levels, 70 and 78%. While when it comes to formal employment, own business, and production, they are much lower than the local community households, particularly so the recent returnee ones. So not surprisingly, given the type of employment, when you look in the middle in the earned income per capita, we observe that recent retrainee households have the lowest earnings. And non-recent returnees are somewhere in between. Now, when we looked at income itself, it was quite similar across the three types of households. However, we noticed that recent returnees and non-recent returnees relied heavily on borrowing. And as you can see on the right-hand side, in these 12 provinces that we are looking at, recent returnees have higher rates of debt and much higher amounts of debt compared to local households. On top of that, so with lower earnings, however, they have higher expenditures driven by the need to spend more given their relocation situation. Finally, we took this household in these 12 provinces and reevaluated the subsistence insecurity index. And we found a stark difference between local households and recent returnees. 74% of local households were subsistence insecure. This value was extremely high at 92% for recent returnees, while non-recent were somewhere in between. When we looked at also at the indicators, in pretty much all of them, recent returnee households were either worse off or similar to the other households, while non-recent returnees were somewhere in between. Okay, so they are sort of catching up with local households. So this presentation that me and Asim just gave you has provided a snapshot of the socio-economic condition in the country. Please do refer to the report for a very comprehensive analysis. Thank you for your attention, and I would like now to hand over to Peter, who will present the report's conclusions and recommendations.
Sincere appreciation to UNDP and all those who contributed to this important report. Producing a report like this is not only about the data and analysis. It is about helping the international community better understand the realities facing the Afghan people and reminding us why continued engagement matters. Indeed, the reality described in this report is a difficult one. For many people in Afghanistan, daily life remains extremely hard. Families are struggling to put food on the table, find work, access health care, and prepare for the future uncertainty. Many communities are trying to cope simultaneously with multiple pressures such as economic hardship, challenges coming from climate change, and the arrival of a large number of returnees. Coping with such pressures is becoming more difficult because of the reduced assistance. What makes this report especially important is that it reminds us that these are not isolated problems. They are interconnected, and together they are placing enormous strain on ordinary people in Afghanistan. While the report notes modest macroeconomic growth, the data clearly indicates that for the majority of Afghan people, meeting basic needs remains a severe challenge. Distinguished participants, one issue that deserves particular attention is the situation of women and girls. The continued restrictions on their education and the participation in public life are deeply concerning. No country can fully move forward if women, who make the half of the population, are put under restrictions and prevented from realizing their potential. Education is the very foundation of the national development. As the report starkly warns, the continued exclusion of women and girls from the education system is actually eroding the country's human capital. It is destroying the pipeline of future female teachers and healthcare professionals. This will have severe, irreversible consequences for Afghanistan's long-term social and economic recovery. At the same time, I'm pleased to refer to the remarkable strength of Afghan women. The review reveals the powerful fact: despite the severe restrictions, female-headed households have successfully pivoted to a home-based production, managing to maintaining their per capita income. This is exactly why Japan has been proudly partnering with U.N.ډي.پي to support Women's Livelihood Project. Our project, which have recently been concluded, have generated numerous success stories, proving that when Afghan women are provided with the right support, they can build self-reliance and drive economic recovery for their communities. I believe that resilience and entrepreneurship deserve not only our respect, but continued and tangible investment. I'd like to take this opportunity to express our deepest gratitude to U.N.ډي.پي, and particularly to the dedicated field staff who have worked tirelessly on the ground to implement these initiatives under extremely challenging conditions. Japan firmly believes that the right and the dignity of women and girls are essential for Afghanistan's future stability and prosperity. Distinguished participants, for many years, Japan has stood alongside the people of Afghanistan. Japan has supported Afghanistan in areas such as humanitarian assistance, healthcare, education, agriculture, infrastructure, disaster risk reduction, and community development. We have worked closely with the United Nations, international organizations, NGOs, and local communities to ensure that the assistance reaches those who need it most. I would also like to recognize the dedication of humanitarian development workers who continue to work under extremely challenging circumstances. Their efforts are making a real difference in the lives of many Afghans. Our commitment remains unchanged. Japan remains committed to supporting the Afghan people, especially the most vulnerable, including women, children, displaced families, and returnees. We strongly support efforts that help communities become more resilient and self-reliant. That is why we highly value the work of the U.N.ډي.پي and its partners in areas such as livelihood, renewable energies, water management, and local infrastructure. These initiatives are important not only because they are addressing immediate needs, but also because they help communities regain stability and hope for the future. Japan also believes that long-term stability depends on creating opportunities for work, for education, and for young people to build a future inside their own communities. Ultimately, Afghanistan's future must be inclusive. A peaceful and prosperous Afghanistan can only be built when all Afghans, women and men alike, are able to contribute fully to society. Distinguished participants, this report is an important reminder that Afghanistan continues to face very serious humanitarian and socio-economic challenges. But it is also a reminder of the resilience and the perseverance of Afghan people. Despite years of hardship, Afghanistan communities continue to show remarkable strength and determination. I believe that the international community needs to keep engaged with Afghanistan and continue to stand with the people and communities of Afghanistan. Continued support remains essential not only to address urgent needs today, but also to help preserve hope and opportunity for the future. Japan will continue working closely with the United Nations, international partners, and humanitarian organizations in support of the people of Afghanistan. At the same time, we will continue to emphasize the importance of human dignity, inclusion, opportunity, and the protection of fundamental rights, especially for women and girls. I hope this socio-economic review and today's discussion will help us strengthen our shared understanding of the challenges facing Afghanistan and reinforce our collective commitment to supporting the Afghan people. Thank you very much.
But prevented from coming, but she would have liked to be here. First, I would like to congratulate the U.N.ډي.پي and the UN family for this substantive work of analysis on the socio-economic situation in Afghanistan. I think, as has also been highlighted before, this type of analysis is crucial for everybody who wants to work on development in Afghanistan. It is to inform the policymakers in Afghanistan, outside Afghanistan, and those of us practitioners, I would call us, who operate in the country, whether in embassies, international NGOs, local NGOs, private sector, who daily work to enhance the conditions for the population in the country. In terms of this sort of analysis, economic analysis happens at the country level. But as I think, Stephen Rodriguez, you also highlighted, poverty is felt at the individual level. And I think it's important that we keep this in mind, and this is where I see a true value of this type of research, because it's bridging the macroeconomic analysis with the community and the household analysis. And I think that link is crucial. And I think this is one of your really value-added contributions through this type of research, so I really appreciate that. So I see this as a very important supplement to the other analysis that are also being presented by international colleagues in the International Development Banks as well. It's hard to disagree with the conclusions and the recommendations in this analysis, and we will continue to study them closely and implement them in the design of our support. But I also, like other speakers have highlighted, this is a red light. The socioeconomic situation in Afghanistan is alarming. There are many alerts that we should consider, already are considering, but need to reflect on. We have talked about several of the shocks that Afghanistan has suffered. I will also do so and maybe highlight how we in the EU are responding to them. One shock, which we have touched upon but not mentioned as a shock, I would call it the policy shock of 2021, which consists of the policies implemented by the de facto authorities and also the policies not implemented or promoted by the de facto authorities. Most importantly of which is, of course, as has already been mentioned, the policies on women, which restrict half the population in terms of their rights, including by not enabling them to contribute fully to the economic activity in this country and access to education. I think the report outlines very clearly the impact on women, both in terms of them being more vulnerable to all the shocks in the country, and that they are underutilized in the economy. So the EU will continue to highlight the role and the responsibilities with regard to women's rights in this country. We will continue to support women in our programming because they are, as we have clearly seen, among the most vulnerable. So that in itself is a solid rationale for the design of our programming. One thing I take away from the report is also the notion that the restrictions on women is not just an issue for now, it's an intergenerational issue. We are robbing future generations of prosperity, and not just the current one. We have discussed the returnee shock to the economy, and we see it is one of the most pertinent reasons why we are seeing a per capita GDP decline. This is of course important and concerning, but also to be expected. The EU continues to support the returnees. Recently, I believe we signed a 25 million grant with a UN organization, and last week we launched and published our intention to fund the returnee and IDP issues in Afghanistan with another 40 million through NGOs. The climate and natural hazards is also, of course, a shock that continues to impact Afghanistan. It is something that we are integrating into all of our support. Thankfully, I understand from the data that this year may be a good agricultural year. We really hope so. I still enjoy the snows on the surrounding mountains on a daily basis, and thinking that this is water for later months. However, also of concern, as was also showed in the analysis, is the impact on the social sectors, access to health especially. Access to health is a particular concern, and I note that in the report the word healthcare collapse is being used. This is no understatement. Recently I had the opportunity to discuss with a young woman who had to cancel her medical education right before she graduated and had to find another livelihood. This is a lost opportunity that Stephen, you also touched upon. So even well-educated women who were just about to graduate now find themselves not being able to contribute to this struggling health sector. In terms of the regional dynamics, is also important. It's a shock that has hit the country fairly recently, but we are also studying the analysis that this seems to be something that might have long-lasting effects on the country, despite the rerouting of trade, as we have seen in this report. So the EU will continue to support social services, livelihoods, private sector. We especially want to move from very basic handouts of support packages to supporting value chains, economic activity in the communities, access to finance, which has also been noted here, and I noted with great satisfaction that more than 40% of the clients in microfinance are women, showing that there are things that can be done to assist. Access to markets is important, that we are supporting. Climate change and water is a cross-cutting priority for everything we do, and of course the support to small and medium-sized enterprises. Now, in doing so, we have to strike a balance between supporting people and the poverty dimension directly, and the more systemic economic aspects. It is a tough choice. Sometimes we have to support systemic initiatives that will have a trickle-down effect, so to speak, in time on the poverty issues. Other times we have to support poverty-related initiatives more directly. It's a tough balance to strike, but your recommendations in the report will help in making those balances. Of course, there is also, as we have discussed, the decline in international support. I would say that these are also linked to the policy shock I mentioned initially, but it is also a global picture. I believe that 23% decline in ODA over the past 1 year globally. So let me stop by saying thank you very much for this. We will take your recommendations to heart. We will hopefully continue this discussion, not just today, also tomorrow and the day after tomorrow, because this is not a report to have just an event, it is a report that needs to be used. We will happily contribute to this dialogue. We will happily be partner in the solutions that has been identified, and the EU will continue to be an important stakeholder in Afghanistan in this regard. Thank you very much indeed.
I would like also to take the opportunity to thank donors and other key stakeholders for being here. We do not take this for granted given the current environment. UNHCR really appreciates this specific focus on the situation of returnees, and we fully agree that immediate action is needed to avoid future deterioration. It is crucial that we do not lose sight that returnees represent over 10% of Afghanistan's current population. We also should remain mindful of the nature of a significant percentage of these returns and how this affects the process of reintegration and therefore social cohesion, social economic inclusion and stability. Your findings, UNDP's review, find that returnees are the most vulnerable category, with substance insecurity affecting over 9 in 10 returnees. And thank you, Stephen, for reminding us what that really means. Returnee families are weighed down by their displacement and return experience, with many returning to Afghanistan with years or a whole life in exile, with no assets, without documents, as it was highlighted, or any knowledge of their province of origin. Many of these findings are consistent with our findings from returnee monitoring and are aligned with the direction of our programs, which seek to address some of these gaps to support reintegration and socio-economic inclusion of returnees. Allow me to highlight perhaps two areas of our work that we carry out in collaboration and with others. This highlight has, what featured very prominently in this report is the lack of documentation affecting returnees, specifically women returnees. We've been working for years in legal assistance in civil identity, today with the support of the EU, and we have plans to move this forward together with U.N.ډي.پي, FAO, and UNICEF, hoping to improve this situation. Also, improving access to finance is also highlighted as a key need, and offers also, which we know offers a strong impact on growing businesses, job creation, and reducing vulnerabilities. We launched, with the support of the EU and Japan, an innovative project to connect returnee entrepreneurs with microgrants with the first microfinance bank in Afghanistan. This helps to boost empowerment and inclusion, thus yielding protection outcomes. Looking forward, we will continue to work together with U.N.ډي.پي, our sister UN agencies, development partners, and other stakeholders, including the private sector, on advancing sustainable reintegration of returnees. This is not a standalone matter or a separate area of work targeting a marginalized group. Reintegration is a multi-stakeholder intervention that requires work across the nexus, humanitarian development peace nexus, and all those different pieces feed into one another. So, coming to your recommendation number 6, supporting an area-based reintegration, what it will be critical is joining efforts, collaborating, humanitarian and BHN actors, moving forward, working together, using this energy you described so well, Stephen, perhaps joined up projects to start with, even a small scale at first, that can offer lessons that can be replicated and scaled up. Thank you for bringing us together.
We have internal displacement, escalating climate risks, and whether this is in urban or rural areas, these are pure stretching families and communities to the limit. So the presentation itself already highlights a lot of figures and statistics, and I do think they speak for themselves. The fact that there's 3 in 4 Afghans that cannot meet basic needs, 2.8 billion returnees in 2025, estimated 3 million people still internally displaced. All of this adds major pressure on services, basic jobs, host communities. And I wanted to underline that these vulnerabilities are not only widespread, but it is also highly localized. We see these differences in different locations. And the vulnerabilities change fast. People are moving, often in cycles, trying different options, times being stuck if there's no safe or viable way forward. Fully agree that economic pressure remains the biggest immediate trigger, but climate and environmental decline increasingly shape what people can do, how they can do it, and where they can seek livelihood. And as the report also highlighted, in Afghanistan, much of this comes back to water. Water insecurity leads to climate stress, to collapsing livelihoods, and then to longer mobility. Drought, groundwater depletion, fogging market systems, all of this multiply risks after and far beyond agriculture. It's across education, local markets. And It certainly does not affect everyone the same way. And today we hear very clearly of the gender dimension. There are fewer options because of options to adapt because of the restrictions, limited access to information services, and exclusion from decision making. All of this also increased unpaid care burdens for women and girls particularly, higher risks and barriers to protection and assistance for both returning and displaced women and female-headed households. All in all, the message, I think, what we hear is very consistent and very clear. Livelihoods are under pressure, people are on the move, and will continue to be on the move unless we can collectively come up with a way to find resilience and solutions. Communities are trying to adapt under worsening climate. And here I want to also echo what others have said before me, the importance of strengthening the link between humanitarian and development action. We should look at multi-year area-based approaches that combine basic services, livelihoods, climate adaptation, and most importantly, gender-responsive programming is non-negotiable for all of us, I think. This is the direction that IOM is pursuing with sister agencies and partners. There's a number of examples. The joint programming in Northern and Western region with the support of SDFA. There's also other collaborations supported by the EU, looking to bring coordinated support to returnees, the displaced, and host communities in targeted locations. So I just wanted to close by saying that the report is great. It gives us an evidence base. Now the real value is what are we going to do with it? And I really look forward to working with EP, UNHCR, and other partners to this analysis into a focused and coordinated actions where it's needed and where the pressure is greatest. So thank you very much.
So two things. One, work is already being done. And I think Tia and Vanessa mentioned there are a number of joint programs already. PIDAR, WADAT in the Northeast, in the West. And so we want to bring the UN agencies together to develop more of these joint programs, but also to scale what is already being done. And I think that's the greatest urgency, to mobilize more partnerships, more resources. And it's not necessarily money coming to us. I mean, there are partners like the EU who are funding other NGO partners, etc. But if we can coordinate into a genuine area-based kind of response where we coordinate action. The second is that we did jointly develop with the national and international NGOs the returnee response and reintegration plan. So there's a very clear blueprint that is in place. And I think this is what we now need to use in our engagements with the DFA, with the international donors, with the IFIs, to see if we can secure the resources necessary to actually take some of this work, as I said, to scale.
Socially speaking, there is the chances for having an improved social outcomes for Afghanistan in the years ahead is really difficult in absence of full return of women back to the economy and the decision making and the agency that they need to have. So if there are policies that we can support that will result in some reversal or full reversal of the bans on women, the outlook for social indicators will change. As for the economy, we have stressed on the role of the private sector because it's a very resilient pillar of the Afghan economy and economic activity, from jobs to production to revenues and household income, and all different indicators are somehow tied to how private sector and business community performs. But looking years ahead, beyond 4 years ahead, one of the critical restraints that hold economic growth back is the energy shortage, because if we can address that as all partners together, including the de facto authorities, if we can help address this situation, that will result into a structural transformation in the economy that would help integrate the labor in non-agricultural, more productive sectors of the economy. And of course, this is a story of the years to come. And maybe happy to take this discussion offline. I hope I addressed that somehow. Thank you.